The rain was relentless that evening, pounding against the windows of Maggie's Diner, a small but welcoming place nestled between towering buildings. Inside, Emily Carter, dressed in her worn-out uniform, moved swiftly between tables, refilling coffee cups and serving plates with a tired but polite smile. Another long shift, another day of barely making ends meet. But that wasn't what occupied her mind. Through the large window, she spotted him again, the small boy who had been appearing outside the diner every night for the past 2 weeks. His thin frame was curled up near the alley, his oversized hoodie doing little to shield him from the cold. His eyes, dark yet filled with quiet hope, watched the customers inside as they ate their meals. He never begged, never approached anyone. He only watched. Emily had noticed him from the very first night. At first, she thought he was waiting for someone, but the more she saw him, the more she realized the truth. He was hungry. He was alone. And yet, he never asked for anything. She couldn't ignore it. That first night, she had quietly packed a leftover sandwich and placed it beside him before walking away. The next night, she did the same, and then again. It became a silent routine, one she never spoke about, never questioned. She wasn't expecting gratitude or recognition. She just couldn't stand the thought of a child going to bed hungry when she had even the smallest means to help. Tonight was no different. After finishing her shift, she wrapped up a warm meal, a grilled cheese sandwich, a small bowl of soup, and a cookie. It wasn't much, but it was something. Stepping outside, she shielded the plate from the rain and quietly approached him. The boy's head lifted instantly, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of her. "Here," Emily said softly, crouching down. "It's warm. Eat before it gets cold." The boy hesitated for a moment, then took the plate carefully as if afraid it might be taken away. "Thank you," he whispered. Emily smiled. "Do you have a name?" The boy glanced up at her, hesitating before finally answering. "Leo." Leo. It suited him. "Well, Leo," she said warmly, "I hope you like grilled cheese." A small, shy smile flickered across his face as he took his first bite. Emily felt a lump form in her throat. "See you tomorrow?" she asked casually. Leo hesitated, then gave a small nod. Emily smiled once more before stepping back inside. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that someone had been watching. Across the street, a man sat in the back of a sleek black car, his piercing blue eyes locked onto the scene that had just unfolded. He had been observing for days, and tonight, he had seen enough. With a slow, thoughtful exhale, the man reached for his phone. His voice was calm, controlled. "Find out everything about the waitress." Emily Carter had always been used to being invisible. People barely noticed her when she poured their coffee, refilled their water glasses, or cleared their plates. That was just how life worked when you were a waitress. You were there, but never truly seen. But today was different. As she moved through the small diner, balancing trays and dodging impatient customers, a shiver crawled up her spine. She wasn't sure why at first, but then she felt it. That distinct, unmistakable sensation of being watched. It wasn't just the usual rude customers who stared too long when they wanted their orders faster. No, this was different. This felt intentional. And then she saw him. At the farthest booth, near the window, a man in an expensive suit sat with his fingers interlaced, watching her with a gaze so sharp it sent a wave of unease through her. His piercing blue eyes stood out even from across the room, their intensity unwavering as he studied her movements. He was too polished, too well dressed for a place like Maggie's Diner, the kind of man who dined in 5-star restaurants, not greasy spoon diners where the waitresses barely made enough to cover rent. Emily tried to shake it off, but the feeling lingered. Who was he? And why was he watching her? She turned away, forcing herself to focus on her job. Maybe he was just waiting for someone. Or maybe she was just imagining things. By midday, the morning rush had died down, and Emily finally had a moment to catch her breath. She wiped the sweat from her brow and grabbed a damp cloth to clean the counter. The man in the suit was still there. His intense stare hadn't wavered. Emily swallowed hard. She had dealt with her fair share of difficult customers, drunks, rude businessmen, even the occasional creep who thought tipping meant he could flirt. But this was different. This man wasn't looking at her the way others did. His expression wasn't leering, nor was it impatient. It was calculating, as if he were trying to figure something out. Emily shook her head. "Get a grip, Carter. He's probably just waiting for his food." Just as she was about to turn away, she noticed something that made her heart stop. His booth was empty. The man was no longer seated. Panic flickered through her chest as she scanned the diner. Where did he go? And then she heard it. A deep voice, smooth, controlled, coming from directly in front of her. "You're Emily Carter." Her breath caught in her throat. She looked up. He was standing at the counter, right in front of her. Up close, he was even more intimidating. His suit was perfectly tailored, the fabric clearly expensive. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered, with a chiseled jawline that could have been sculpted by an artist. Everything about him screamed power, wealth, control. Emily's fingers tightened around the cloth she was holding. How did he know her name? She cleared her throat, trying to keep her voice steady. "And you are?" The man's lips curved slightly. Not quite a smile, but something close to amusement. Instead of answering, he reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a sleek black business card. He slid it across the counter. Emily hesitated before picking it up. The gold lettering was crisp, elegant. Alexander Grant, CEO, Grant Enterprises. Her stomach dropped. Number Way. She had heard that name before. Everyone had. Alexander Grant was one of the wealthiest men in the country, a billionaire tech mogul who was constantly on magazine covers. He was the kind of man who made headlines for business deals, private jets, and luxury estates. What the hell was he doing in her diner? And more importantly, why did he know her name? She forced herself to stay composed, gripping the business card tightly. "Okay," she said cautiously. "You clearly know who I am, but I have no idea why you're here, Mr. Grant." The amusement in his expression faded slightly. He studied her for a long moment before speaking. "I've been watching you, Emily." Her heart skipped a beat. "What?" she breathed. His voice remained calm, unreadable. "I've been observing you for the past few days, and I've seen what you do." Emily's hands went cold. "What I do?" A sinking feeling settled in her stomach. "How you leave food outside for the boy," he continued, "every night without fail." Emily froze. Her breath caught in her throat as her mind raced. He knows. He saw her feeding Leo. For some reason, that terrified her. She opened her mouth to speak, to deny, to deflect, to say anything, but nothing came out. Alexander Grant tilted his head slightly, watching her carefully. "You don't know who he is, do you?" he asked. Emily blinked. "Leo?" He nodded. She frowned, trying to process what he was saying. "He's just a kid, a homeless kid who's hungry." Her voice turned defensive. "I was just trying to help." For the first time, Alexander's expression shifted. Something flickered across his face, something almost unreadable. After a long pause, he said, "And you never asked for anything in return?" Emily's brows knitted together. "Of course not. Why would I?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he exhaled slowly, as if considering something. Then after a moment, he said something that changed everything. "Leo isn't just any homeless boy." Emily's breath caught. "What?" "He's been missing." Alexander's voice was calm, measured, but filled with a weight she didn't understand. "For months, his family has been looking for him." Emily stared at him, her mind spinning. "That's impossible," she said, shaking her head. "He's just... You don't know the full story." Emily's throat went dry. She had thought she was just helping a boy in need, but now Now it seemed she had just stepped into something much, much bigger than she ever could have imagined. And Alexander Grant wasn't here by accident. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. Her hands clenched the edge of the counter, the weight of Alexander Grant's words settling over her like a heavy fog. Leo isn't just any homeless boy. He's been missing. His family has been looking for him. No, she muttered, shaking her head. That doesn't make sense. Alexander's eyes remained locked onto hers, unwavering and serious. Emily had spent the last few weeks bringing Leo food, watching him sit by the alley, shivering in the cold, clutching his threadbare jacket. He was just a kid who had nowhere to go. She had assumed he was like every other runaway, abandoned, forgotten. But now she wasn't so sure. She forced herself to breathe, her throat dry. What do you mean he's been missing? Alexander leaned forward slightly, his presence overwhelming. He's not just some kid off the streets, Emily. His real name is Leonardo Bennett. He's the son of James Bennett. Emily's breath hitched. Wait. Her mind raced, trying to place the name. Then it hit her. James Bennett? As in Bennett Industries? Alexander nodded. Emily felt sick. James Bennett was one of the wealthiest businessmen in the country, a real estate mogul worth billions. He was the type of man who appeared in glossy magazines, standing next to politicians, donating millions to charities. And Leo? Leo was his son? She shook her head. That's impossible. If he's so rich, why is his son living on the streets? Why is he starving? Alexander's jaw tightened. Because he ran away. Emily blinked. Why? Silence stretched between them. Alexander exhaled. That's complicated. She hated that answer. She crossed her arms, her stomach churning. Number, you don't get to do that. You just turned my entire world upside down. Tell me why. Alexander studied her, then slowly said, because his father is one of the most ruthless men you'll ever meet. Emily's mouth went dry. She had heard the rumors about James Bennett, cold, cruel, heartless, but she had never imagined it could be this bad. Alexander continued, his voice low. Leo didn't just run away, he was escaping. Emily's chest tightened. Escaping what? Alexander didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his suit pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen, then turned it toward her. Emily's eyes widened. A missing child's poster filled the screen. There, in black and white, was Leo's face. The words underneath made her stomach twist. Missing, Leonardo Bennett, age. 12 last seen, New York City. Emily's head spun. This wasn't some mistake. This was real. Leo wasn't just a homeless boy. He was a missing person, a billionaire's missing son. And now she was caught in the middle of something far bigger than she ever imagined. Emily felt sick. Her world had shifted in an instant. Alexander watched her reaction closely. I know this is a lot to take in. She let out a shaky breath. You think? He didn't react to her sarcasm. Instead, he tapped his fingers against the counter, his gaze calculating. I need to know something, Emily, he said. She forced herself to look at him. What? His expression darkened. Has anyone else noticed you helping him? Emily's blood ran cold. Why would he ask that? She swallowed. No, I don't think so. Alexander's jaw tensed. Are you sure? Her mind raced through the past few weeks. No one had ever questioned her when she brought food outside. No one had ever paid attention. Had they? Emily's breath hitched. Why? What aren't you telling me? Alexander glanced toward the diner's entrance, as if expecting someone to walk in. Then he leaned in. You need to understand something, Emily, he said, his voice low, serious. James Bennett isn't just rich. He's dangerous. Emily stiffened. What do you mean? Alexander's lips pressed into a thin line. He doesn't just want Leo back. He wants him back at any cost. A shiver ran down her spine. She thought back to Leo, His haunted eyes, the bruises on his arms, the way he flinched at loud noises. Oh God, what if Alexander was telling the truth? What if Leo wasn't just running away from home? He was running for his life. She felt sick. She had just wanted to help a hungry kid, and now she might have just put herself in serious danger. Emily clenched her fists. If he's in danger, why don't you go to the police? Alexander's expression darkened. You think that hasn't been tried? Emily frowned. What do you mean? Alexander leaned back, exhaling slowly. Bennett owns half the city. He has cops, lawyers, politicians in his pocket. There have been investigations, all of them shut down before they could go anywhere. Emily's stomach churned. So what do you want from me? Alexander met her gaze. I need you to tell me where Leo is. Her body tensed. Every instinct screamed at her to be careful. Who was Alexander Grant, really? Why did he care so much? Emily hesitated. And what happens if I do? A pause. Then, the truth. I'm getting him out, Alexander said. Emily blinked. Out? Alexander's eyes gleamed. I've been working on this for weeks, trying to track him down. Now that I've found him, I'm not letting Bennett get to him first. Emily's heart pounded. She wanted to believe him. But could she? Everything was happening too fast. Alexander must have sensed her hesitation because his voice softened. I know you don't trust me. She swallowed. Would you? A ghost of a smirk flickered across his lips. No. Emily didn't smile. So why should I tell you anything? Alexander leaned forward. Because if you don't, he said, his voice low and firm, James Bennett will find him first. A chill ran through Emily's veins, and in that moment she realized she was about to make a very dangerous choice, one that could change everything. Emily's mind raced. She felt trapped between two impossible choices. Could she trust Alexander? Or was she about to put Leo in more danger? She glanced toward the alley where she had last seen the boy. A part of her wanted to run, to grab Leo and disappear before anyone could take him. But she knew that was impossible. She was just a struggling waitress. Alexander, on the other hand, had resources. Why do you care so much? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander didn't answer immediately. Then, after a long pause, he exhaled. Because I know what it's like to be him. Emily frowned. What? For the first time, something flickered in his expression, something raw. I wasn't born into money, he admitted. I grew up in foster homes. I know what it's like to be powerless. His jaw tightened. And I know what it's like to run. Emily swallowed. She hadn't expected that. She studied him carefully, searching for any sign of deceit, but all she saw was a man who looked haunted. Finally, she made a decision. Leo's at the old library, she whispered. He sleeps in the back, near the boiler room. It's the only place that's warm at night. Alexander nodded, immediately pulling out his phone. He typed something quickly, then looked back at her. Come with me. Emily hesitated. Why? Because if you're not with me, he said, Leo won't trust me. Her breath caught. He was right. With a deep breath, she untied her apron and tossed it onto the counter. Let's go. They hurried down the street, cutting through back alleys to avoid drawing attention. The air was freezing, but Emily barely felt it. Her heart pounded too hard. As they neared the library, something shifted in Alexander's expression. His body tensed, his steps slowing. What is it? Emily whispered. He held up a hand, motioning for her to stop. Then he scanned the street. His entire demeanor had changed, his sharp businessman's persona replaced with something dangerous. Emily followed his gaze, and then she saw it. A black car parked across from the library. Its tinted windows concealed the driver, but the presence was unmistakable. A cold dread settled in her stomach. Is that? Yes, Alexander murmured. James Bennett's men. Panic surged through Emily. What do we do? Alexander's jaw clenched. "We get to Leo first." But before they could take another step, the car door opened, and a man in a dark suit stepped out. Emily's breath caught as the man turned toward them, and then he started walking their way. Emily's heart slammed against her ribs. The man in the dark suit strode toward them with cold precision, his eyes locked onto Alexander. "We need to move. Now," Alexander muttered, grabbing Emily's wrist and pulling her toward a narrow alley beside the library. Emily barely had time to process what was happening before she was running. Her boots pounded against the pavement, her breath sharp in the freezing air. Behind them, she could hear the man's footsteps quicken. Alexander pulled her around a corner, pressing her against the wall. His breathing was controlled, but there was tension in his jaw. "Stay quiet," he whispered. Emily's mind raced. Leo was inside. But how were they supposed to get to him without being seen? A few seconds later, the suited man passed the alley, his gaze scanning the street. He pulled out his phone and spoke into it, his voice low and firm. Emily's stomach twisted. They weren't just dealing with one of Bennett's men. There were more coming. Alexander grabbed her hand again. "We go in through the back." Emily didn't argue. They moved quickly, slipping through the shadows until they reached the rusted side door of the library. Alexander tested the handle. It was locked. He didn't hesitate. He pulled something from his pocket, a small metal tool, and within seconds the door clicked open. Emily didn't even have time to be surprised. They slipped inside. The air inside the abandoned library was stale, filled with the scent of dust and old paper. The faint hum of the boiler room vibrated through the floor. Emily whispered, "Leo." For a moment there was silence. Then from the shadows, a small figure emerged. Leo. His wide brown eyes darted between her and Alexander. "Emily?" His voice was laced with confusion and fear. "What are you doing here?" Emily stepped forward. "Leo, we need to go, now." But before she could take another step, a noise echoed through the building. The front door creaked open. Emily's blood ran cold. They weren't alone. Alexander moved fast. He pulled Leo close and whispered, "Stay quiet." Alexander moved fast. He pulled Leo close and whispered, "Stay quiet." Leo's face paled, but he nodded. Emily's heart pounded as she heard footsteps approaching. "Spread out," a deep voice ordered. Emily swallowed hard. James Bennett's men were inside. Alexander scanned the room, his mind working fast. He motioned toward the back door. "We take the fire exit." They crept toward the emergency door, moving as quietly as possible. But just as Alexander reached for the handle, a voice rang out. "Going somewhere?" Emily froze. One of Bennett's men stood in the doorway, a smirk on his face. Leo stiffened beside her, his grip tightening around Emily's arm. Alexander didn't hesitate. He pushed Leo behind him. "You don't want to do this," he said evenly. The man chuckled. "Oh, I think I do. Mr. Bennett wants his son back, and he's paying very well to make sure that happens." Emily's pulse pounded. She could feel Leo trembling beside her. Alexander's jaw clenched. Then, faster than Emily could process, he moved. In a single fluid motion, he grabbed a nearby chair and swung it hard. Crack! The man staggered back, cursing. "Run!" Alexander barked. Emily grabbed Leo's hand and sprinted toward the fire exit. She shoved the door open, the icy night air slamming into her. Behind her, she heard Alexander throw another punch before following close behind. They ran down the alley, across the street. Emily didn't know where they were going. She only knew they had to get away. She could hear the men shouting behind them. Then, tires screeched. A black SUV swerved into view, cutting them off. The back door swung open, and stepping out was a man Emily had only ever seen in magazines, James Bennett. His sharp blue eyes locked onto Leo, cold and calculating. "Leo," he said smoothly, as if this were just a normal conversation, "it's time to come home." Leo's grip on Emily's hand tightened, and Emily knew, in that moment, she wasn't going to let him go. The world seemed to freeze as James Bennett stepped out of the SUV, his piercing blue eyes fixed on Leo. The streetlights cast sharp shadows on his expensive suit, the very image of power and control. Leo stiffened beside Emily, his small fingers gripping hers so tightly it hurt. She could feel his fear. His entire body trembled, his breath quick and uneven. "Leo," James repeated, his voice eerily calm, "get in the car." Emily's heart pounded. She instinctively took a step back, shielding the boy behind her. "He's not going anywhere with you." James exhaled through his nose, a small, almost amused smile touching his lips. "And who exactly are you to say that?" His gaze flickered to Alexander. "I see you found yourself a hero, son." Emily's breath caught. "Son?" She turned to Alexander in shock. He hadn't told her. He hadn't mentioned that James Bennett wasn't just some rich businessman hunting Leo down. He was Leo's father. Leo's grip tightened. "I don't want to go with him," he whispered. Emily looked down at him. His big brown eyes were pleading, desperate. She had never felt more protective in her life. Alexander stepped forward. "You lost the right to call him your son a long time ago." His voice was ice cold. "You don't get to demand anything from him now." James sighed, shaking his head. "You're still as naive as ever." He turned to Leo. "Come now. You don't want to upset me, do you?" Leo shuddered. Emily could feel his panic rising. She wasn't going to let this happen, not without a fight. James gave a subtle nod. The moment he did, two of his men moved toward them. Emily braced herself, but before she could react, Alexander lunged. Everything became a blur. Alexander threw a brutal punch, knocking one of the men to the ground. The second thug swung at him, but Alexander dodged, landing a sharp elbow to his ribs. Emily pulled Leo back, her mind racing. They needed to get out of here, now. James watched the fight with an almost bored expression. He took a step forward, his eyes locking onto Emily. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Emily's pulse pounded, but she stood her ground. "Leo's not your pawn. You don't get to buy him like you buy everything else." James chuckled. "Everything in life has a price, dear, even loyalty." His gaze flickered toward Alexander. "Isn't that right?" Alexander froze for just a fraction of a second, and that was all it took. One of the thugs recovered, grabbing Alexander from behind and slamming him into the pavement. Leo screamed. Emily's chest tightened. "No!" James sighed. "Enough of this!" He snapped his fingers. Before Emily could react, another man grabbed her wrist, yanking her back. She struggled, kicking and clawing, but he was too strong. Leo screamed again, trying to reach for her, but James' men pulled him away. Emily's heart shattered. "No, no, no!" She thrashed against the grip holding her, desperation fueling her every movement. But it was useless. James knelt in front of Leo. "You belong with me," he murmured. "Not with these people." Leo shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I hate you," he whispered. James' expression darkened. Then, a siren wailed in the distance. James' head snapped up. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the night. Someone had called the cops. The men holding Emily and Alexander hesitated. James clenched his jaw, looking at Leo one last time. "This isn't over." Then, in a swift motion, he turned and strode back to the SUV. His men released their hold and followed. Emily collapsed to her knees, gasping as she pulled Leo into her arms. The SUV roared to life and sped off, disappearing into the night. The police arrived moments later, questioning them about what had happened. Emily knew James Bennett was too powerful to be arrested over something like this, but at least, for now, Leo was safe. As the officers drove away, Alexander sat beside her on the curb. His knuckles were bloodied, his lips split, but he only looked at Leo. Leo sniffled, wiping his nose. "Is he gonna come back?" Alexander exhaled. "Not if I have anything to say about it." Emily ran her fingers through Leo's messy hair. "You're safe with us." Leo hesitated. Then for the first time since they had met, he smiled. Emily felt her heart ache. This boy deserved a real family. He deserved love, safety, a future. And deep down, she knew. She and Alexander were going to give him exactly that.